The first lecture, titled Kracauers Medium, will be given by Inga Pollmann. She is an associate professor of film studies at the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures at the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She conducts research at the intersection of film and media studies, philosophy, and the history of science. Her work focuses on the history of film theory and the significance of the moving image for aesthetics. Her most recent publications are Cinematic Vitalism, Film and Theory, and the Question of Life, and Environmental Aesthetics, tracing a latent image from early safari films to contemporary art cinema. Thank you very much. Welcome, Inga.
Okay, so I'll jump right in. With this talk, I want to venture into some preliminary thoughts about medium and mediation in Kracauer's text. What is mediated? What does a medium do? And finally, what is a medium? Rather than pursuing this question semantically, Kracauer employs, for the most part, a fairly conventional use of the word, in the sense of technological medium. I want to suggest that across his works, mediation is a central tenet, a perspective that allows us to expand Kracauer's film theory to the contemporary mediascape. To some extent, I am thus applying Walter Benjamin's notion of medium to Kracauer's texts. Medium, for Benjamin, referred to the field, the environment, the milieu, the atmosphere in which perception occurs. The medium of perception, das Medium der Wahrnehmung, is technically and historically conditioned by apparatuses, such as film, that impact the human sensorium. Therefore, as Antonio Somaini puts it succinctly, a study of media in Benjamin's sense is, quote, the study of the different material and technical articulations of the environment, the milieu, the atmosphere, the Umwelt, in which perception takes place. Film or photography are, in Benjamin's phrasing, apparatuses shaping the historical conditions of the medium, aka milieu or atmosphere, of perception. It is in our critical engagement with these apparatuses which, together with environmental factors, constitute a kind of milieu for our abilities to perceive, that this milieu, its conditionings, becomes visible to us so that we may confront them. Kracauer does not focus on this larger history of perception of the medium of perception in the same ways as Benjamin. Yet Kracauer's texts on film or photography likewise engage the historical interaction between technological medium, that is apparatus, milieu as medium of perception, and perceiving human by focusing on these apparatuses' screening of the milieu, which can then become visible to us as medium of perception. Across Kracauer's writings, then, if we don't get hung up on terminology, one can find elaborations on the mediating role of milieu or environment and mood or atmosphere, also, and maybe especially, in texts not about technological media. Thinking about mediation in this broad sense opens up our reception of Kracauer's work to correspondences with a wide array of theories, approaches, objects, and concerns in media studies. Examples include work on elemental media, on atmospheric media or mood in film, on media's materiality in the form of extraction, pollution, terraforming, and environmental concerns, on media and climate change or the Anthropocene, etc. Such an opening could provide an exciting addition to more historiographic approaches to Kracauer that have dominated the latest return to his work in classical film theory more generally. And it could allow us to ask with Kracauer, where do we go from here? And how can his work help us make sense of current media phenomena? So in what follows, I want to think further about the interaction of environment, technological medium, and human perception and agency in Kracauer's texts, and to do so, I'll move through several texts and examples. Beginning with a reading of Kracauer's Farewell to the Linden Arcade, I will dwell on the symptomatic role of milieu, medium, and mood in the texts, terms I will in a second part discuss and complicate. In the third section, I turn to Kracau's writings on film, in the photography essay, From Caligari to Hitler and Theory of Film, and their discussion of film's role in and for mediation. In the following section, I turn to the present to ask to what an extent Kracau's media theory and categories are still applicable or can be modified to accommodate contemporary media environments. From here, I'll move on to two examples, the photographic work of artist Trevor Paglen and an amateur video circulating on social media. So I'll begin with the first part. In 1930, Kracauer wrote in Abschied von der Lindenpassage: Beides, das ganz Nahe und das ganz Ferne, entweicht der bürgerlichen Öffentlichkeit, die es nicht duldet, und zieht sich gern ins heimliche Dämmer des Durchgangs zurück, in dem es aufblüht wie in einem Sumpf. Eben als Passage ist der Durchgang zugleich auch der Ort, an dem sich wie kaum sonst wo die Reise darstellen kann, die der Aufbruch aus dem Nahen zur Ferne ist und Leib und Bild miteinander verbindet. Kracau's description here mobilizes a complex physical image, the very near and the very far. These terms refer to bodily needs and the craving for images, the sort that appear in daydreams. Both are transgressive and not tolerated by the bourgeois public. Speaking of the secretive twilight of the throughway, the thoroughfare, the swamp, Kracauer weaves together words that connote illicit, dark, and dirty physicality. The combination of swamp and thoroughfare refers us to passages into and out of the body, mouth, vagina, and rectum. In these swampy regions, wet and fertile, rich in biomass and bacteria, that themselves are already read upon the body, that particular trip can be dargestellt, can present itself, that departs from the near, the body and its needs, and moves to the far, daydream-like desired images, a trip that thus connects body and image. All of this is, of course, an only thinly veiled reference to film, the whole arcade and its dark interior map onto the movie theater, that place that is both public and a retreat from the public. The physical description of the arcade highlights that it is simultaneously interior and surface. We are reminded that the colon is an interior surface, channeling, absorbing, and transforming exterior matter. What's in the colon is waste, in the body, but not of the body. Body and image are mapped onto this physical sexual architecture. Arcades, Kracauer says a few sentences prior, are thoroughfares, walks, Durchgänge, Gänge, through bourgeois life, which itself dwells, quote, in front of and on top of its entrances. Mündungen, another ambivalent word choice. Mündung, related to Mund, mouth, is an orifice or opening where the focus is on something coming out of this opening. Mündung of a river, Mündung of a street, Mündung of a weapon. In Kracau's text images, the bodily architecture expands to specify that the arcades are the bowels of the bourgeois body, the public parts of which are on the streets and in its parlors, while the orifice of the arcade leads to its private parts. There's thus a double meaning associated with Kracau's description of the arcades as passageways, ways that pass through bourgeois life. They constitute a stroll through the truth of bourgeois life and are, in the physical imagery of the text, a kind of invagination, Einstülpung, a hidden surface, the libidinal colon of the bourgeoisie, containing the abgeschiedene, ausgestoßene, and hineingestoßene, the excluded, the cast off, and the disavowed aspects of public bourgeois life. And you can tell that the English translation doesn't quite capture the physical connotations of the original German. Kracauer describes the milieu of the Linden Arcade as though it was a particular biological medium, a growth medium, a Nährboden, enabling and growing blossoms of the very close and the very distant body and image. The distinction between medium and milieu, the technical and the physical, environmental, collapses here. The arcade's interior becomes revelatory to the attentive observer who reads it tenderly, both in contradistinction to the public bourgeois surface whence he came, and across its surface, which, like the photographic capture in Kracauer's essay on photography, combines refuse in revealing combinations. And refuse, trash, the discarded, as you will recall, is central to Kracauer's notion of what film and photography focus on. It's what we can reclaim via technological media. Farewell to the Linden Arcade combines those three aspects of mediation, central also to Kracauer's other texts, comprising a comprehensive media theory beyond film. There's first of all the technological medium, the apparatus such as photography and film. Its mediation is, second, connected to historical, social, physical situatedness, environment, or milieu, and can only be understood in conjunction with this situatedness, which it is able to communicate. This second aspect, the milieu, milieu, French for middle place, medium, is semantically and historically related to medium. A milieu is a medium conditioning, resisting, and enabling dynamic interactions of life within. Making milieu or environment a part of a comprehensive media theory on Kracauer's part means mediation is always situated. It is historical, physical, even existential, and also social. Milieu mediates. Technological media can mediate the milieu's mediation. The third component of this expanded notion of mediation is the human being. Flaneur, streetwalker, moviegoer, filmmaker, and her relationship to both her milieu and the affordances of technological media. This relationship, this active reading, requires openness and sensitivity, so that the surfaces of everyday life and of images reveal themselves. It may best be captured with terms such as mood, atmosphere, resonance, attunement, empathy, terms that also keep reappearing in Kracauer's texts. Environmental, like milieu, yet less concrete, mood and atmosphere indicate the aesthetic aspect of mediation, rather than existential givens determining us, as in the case of milieu. These terms point toward airs, tendencies, possibilities that communicate between the subjective and the objective and prefigure future, past, and alternative presence. A brief note on the words milieu and mood, milieu and Stimmung, is in order. Both are historically and ideologically suspect. Kracauer himself uses the words only with caution. Milieu, across his writings, usually refers to environments that are themselves descriptive of the individuals in it, as in Zille milieu films. For Kracauer and most of his contemporaries, the terms determinism, its genesis from positivism and its role in Marxism, forecloses possibilities of actively engaging with the environment, of a productive perceptual gap between self and environment. Environment, or Umwelt, is more neutral, albeit with a baggage of its own, though it loses the direct connection to medium. Stimmung, mood, is for Kracauer associated with a presumed identity of inner and outer reality, of personal mood and mood of the environment, a harmony that is assumed in colloquial uses of the word, especially in the context of bourgeois culture. In From Caligari to Hitler, for example, the word mood can refer on the one hand to a collective or personal mood, the German mood of Aufbruch after the war, or Karl Mayer's and Hans Janowitz's shared revolutionary moods, and on the other hand to the way in which films seek to convey a quality of reality, the mood of resignation in Karl Grune's Die Straße, the neutral, such as life mood of cross-section films, etc. The rise of the term Stimmung in the 18th century can itself be traced to shifts in the relationship of inner and outer reality. It correlates with the loss of a worldview that supposes a pre-stabilized world harmony, as in Leibniz's philosophy. Attunement, adjustment between internal and external mood became necessary in a dynamic world in which the subject's place had to be negotiated again and again. Even when harmony between external world and inner disposition was attained, it became a temporary and relative harmony, no absolute one. For this very reason, the rise of Stimmung and aesthetics is often connected to a longing for a connection with a larger whole. In some sense, it is this history or story of a rift and attempted adjustments, denial, and longing that Kracauer is tracing in From Caligari to Hitler, albeit with a slightly different terminology. For these reasons, I believe a return to terms such as mood and milieu and their complicated historical baggage might prove insightful, both in order to highlight the way in which Kracauer intervenes in their conservative, holistic connotation, and in order to use his work to complicate contemporary theoretical frameworks operating with these terms. To better understand the role of technical mediation within the triangulation of human observer, environment, and apparatus in the next section, I'll move through some of Kracauer's writings on film and their discussion of mood on the one hand and reality and nature as terms describing the environment on the other. So I'm moving to my third section now. The nature of reality and the unreality of nature, photography from Caligari to Hitler, and theory of film. In his essay on photography, Kracauer laid out terms that connect his pre-war text to his post-war writings, from Caligari to Hitler, to theory of film, to the book on history. The main point in this 1928 essay, written in a year that in the Caligari book he will itself describe as a watershed moment, is the identification of a wager, what he terms the go-for-broke game of history. This game and its risk of all or nothing hinges on photography and film's ability to make visible mere nature, completely disconnected from human consciousness. This mere nature is, according to Kracauer, the same nature that, quote, flourishes in the reality of the society produced by this capitalist mode of production. The society of the mass ornament, of a rampant yet insufficient rationality, Zweckrationalität. Nature flourishes in reality, he says. Film and photography, in visualizing reality, can thus depict reality in such a way that the mere nature in it can become visible. However, this risky gamble of giving over to nature needs to be reined in a second step by consciousness, by reading these images of nature presented in and by photography and film, by reflecting on nature outside of consciousness, and subsequently taking action to control it without being imprisoned by it. Nature needs to be recognized as such, as separate from consciousness. The wager is thus that we should neither fall prey to photography's order, nor can we rely on our own faculties to grasp reality. Cognition is only possible in engaging the alienated state of both our environment and ourselves by means of alienating media. Memory, an individual's or collective's meaningful ordering of time, can only construct false history as long as the human being has not grasped herself in distinction from, beyond, her natural foundation. Historiography and photography can present contingent, non-human orders of time and space, respectively, and herein lies their potential. Kracauer also applies this wager, this concept of the go-for-broke game, to his commissioned history of German cinema. While in an abstract, theoretical sense, cinematic images offer up the chance of a non-anthropocentric order, films are practically the product of a tight interaction of individuals, apparatuses, and capitalist interests, and thus film form itself often retains narrative and visual orders reflecting false consciousness, a consciousness embedded in nature. Kracauer's reading of films in From Caligari to Hitler, when viewed from the vantage point of the photography essays, many phrases of which reappear in the Caligari book, becomes a history of tracing how, in these films, consciousness guided form, creating stories, camera movements, mise en scène, montage patterns that in turn reflected the current state of a nature flourishing in the reality of the society produced by this capitalist mode of production. But the Caligari book also traces how, usually in brief instance, when the filmmaker lets reality dictate his aesthetic sensibilities, rather than his consciousness of reality as nature, film form was able to live up to its potential of offering the natural order of things to consciousness. One small example of this is Kracauer's discussion of Georg Wilhelm Pabst's The Love of Jan Nye. In his comments on the film, Kracauer cites Paul Rother, who wrote that in the film, quote, "Every curve, every angle, every approach of the lens was controlled by the material that it photographed for the expression of mood," unquote. Kracauer expands on this quote by commending Pabst for a novel way to make use of the mobile camera. He used it, quote, "to photograph the casual configurations of real life," unquote. Both Photography Essay and the Caligari book operate with terms that play into the broader concept of medium in Kracauer, nature and reality. There's the innate property of the photographic image to offer nature as non-human, unordered inventory, as unrecognized, unreckoned with, and, quote, alienated from meaning, unquote. Nature has, as Miriam Hansen described it, a ferociously pejorative valence and is the allegorical name for any reality that posits itself as given and immutable, unquote. Nature is a subsection of reality. Photography and film, even more so, allow us to question this immutability. Reading their images, we can learn ways of countering this nature in reality, of confronting it, as he says in Theory of Film, of interacting with it and changing it. It is this property of media that Kracauer addresses again in Theory of Film when he speaks of photography's and film's ability to record and their potential to reveal. Only when they seize this revelatory potential do films, quote, come into their own. Kracauer splits reality into inner and outer. Inner reality is, in the Caligari book, described as mind, soul, inner or psychological disposition. Focusing on inward life, ideology, and spiritual concerns, he says in Theory of Film, makes a film less cinematic, not seizing its innate recording and revealing function. Outer reality, physical reality, is open-ended, limitless. A world, he says, in contrast to the finite and ordered cosmos set by tragedy. These comments in the preface of Theory of Film mark the distance between this book and From Caligari to Hitler. Kracauer is turning away from an account of the influence and depiction of inner and outer realities and instead focuses on the potentials of grasping outer realities. In a sense, thus, it's a move from Stimmung, which negotiates internal and external mood, to atmosphere. Theory of Film's emphasis on reality and nature is, in light of this history, complex, ambivalent, and far from naive. Mediation reveals the conditions of the world we live in to us by both recording them and rendering them alien, by separating us from them, by making us strangers in it and to it. Nature in the raw, nature as it exists independently of us, in Theory of Film has become synonymous with unstaged reality in its flux, and it's no longer a metaphysical part of it. With the help of a technological medium such as film, the human being can give primacy to that which lies outside herself and relate to it with, quote, empathy. An empathy and surrender on the part of not only spectator but also filmmaker, so that her attunement to the environment in turn impacts the film's form, style, and structure. This state of empathy, attunement, or resonance on the part of filmmaker and film viewer requires the individual to hold back her own internal patterns of perception and meaning-making, what Kracauer describes as the spectator's active passivity in the history book. When attuned to outer reality in this way, director, camera person, editor, etc., can use their technical tools to mediate, to make visible outer reality as alien, an alienation affected both by the technological medium's metamorphosis of nature and the spectator's, quote, cognizance, by the double movement of human attunement and technological affinity, by a commitment to revealing the state of affairs and an appropriate tool to do so, in a human-machine assemblage that can render strange because of this attunement. It is in this sense that one could speak of an environmental aesthetic in Kracauer, in which environment and attunement or resonance to a shared atmosphere are necessary components of technological mediation. This environmental aesthetic resists the dissolution of critical categories, as certain proponents of media ecology suggest, in favor of a neutral, non-anthropocentric ecological network. And I'm thinking, for example, here of Timothy Morton's work. Kracauer remains oriented toward possibilities for cognition and critique and insists on difference against holistic, all-encompassing, and thus closed frameworks. Okay, I'm moving to my last part. Recent work on the idea of the Anthropocene, the idea that the world, physical reality, has in the wake of the great acceleration itself been profoundly shaped by human presence and activity, seems to undo the very foundation of Kracauer's media philosophy. How can physical reality be rendered as others to humans if it isn't, or not completely? How can it be understood if its essential aspects, such as climate change, too grand, too slow, elude human experience, an argument that Chakrabarty has made? An erosion similar to that of the distinction between human and environment seems to have affected the relationship between technological media and physical reality. New media are increasingly environmental themselves, dispersed and decentralized in clouds and networks, mobile and endlessly mutable and programmable, algorithmically attuned to minute environmental changes. They not only record physical reality, they increasingly constitute it. And finally, faced with a variety of new media, even if we restrict ourselves to those that operate visually, the question remains to what an extent we could extend or modify film's affinities for unstaged reality, the fortuitous, endlessness, the indeterminate, and the flow of life. Aren't these qualities we ascribe often negatively to digital media? Is Kracauer's film theory ultimately too medium-specific? One possible way in which Kracauer's mid-century film theory continues to help us understand the contemporary mediascape and the growing recognition of global environmental crises is to transfer his dynamic of cognition and revelation via media wholesale, yet insists on its foundations, difference and interrelatedness of environment, media, humans. Technological media, like film, record a physical reality of which the media themselves are a part, just as humans are. Physical reality for Kracauer was never a naive notion of nature, as I just outlined, but included technology and mediation. And today, even more so than in Kracauer's lifetime, physical reality is the reality of computation, distributed media, and human-made environmental change. In this sense, artist Trevor Paglen's work might be instructive to think about the legacy and applicability of Kracauer's media theory. Paglen has worked with comprehensive technological systems aimed at recognition and reconnaissance, including surveillance technology, such as drones and satellites, facial recognition software, etc. These technologies' express aim is to reveal underlying structures and to recognize patterns in excess of human abilities of cognition. They substitute for human activity algorithmic knowledge and pattern recognition. In our current environment, abstract thinking, abstract vision that is unable to see things for themselves, as he discusses it in the epilogue of Theory of Film, is not exercised on the part of a scientifically minded human failing to apprehend physical reality, but is the invisible work and vision of a machine we rely on to navigate reality. In Paglen's Cloud series, photographs of clouds are overlaid with lines and circles depicting the vision of various computer algorithms used in technologies such as guided missiles and drones, autonomous surveillance systems, self-driving cars, facial recognition, 3D modeling, and many other computer vision contexts. These algorithms are trained to look for faces, key points, lines, circles, and other areas of interest in a landscape. Their perception, visible in these lines and circles, attempts to structure and simplify the photograph by dividing it into a series of sections. The algorithm's abstract and limited vision becomes visible. Its unfeeling, non-aesthetic apprehension of an object, in this case, a cloud formation. The cloud itself, aesthetically a motif with a long tradition associated with Stimmung and atmosphere, is a peculiar non-object, a visual appearance with modulated shape, a distinct body, painterly tactility, and endless modulations of color, density, light, and shadow, yet fleeting, ephemeral, elusive, ungraspable. The composite of photograph and machinic failure to grasp both cloud as object and its aesthetic value allows the beholder to reflect on our conditions of meaning-making when confronted with an image. Paglen's images visualize the usually invisible ubiquity of algorithmic technologies that undergird and survey our everyday movements and practices. And I think I have another one. These images can give new valence to the physical reality technological media make visible for Kracauer. Physical reality included for Kracauer a world atomized by the abstractions of science, technology, and capitalism. Today's physical reality is, additionally, ever more determined by media environments that are already mediated, to an extent that it is at times difficult to distinguish between mediated and unmediated perception and action. By visualizing an algorithm's pattern recognition on top of an image readable and recognizable by us, our perceptual ground shifts. Paglen's work illustrates not only mediated environments, but also lets us reflect on the possibilities of environmental phenomena functioning as media. Right? So it's a kind of Kippfigur that also forms the basis of John Durham Peters' philosophy of elemental media, the marvelous clouds. While the reception of Paglen's images, just like their creation, happens within the determinate, reflexive framework of art, my second example is an amateur drone video that circulated on social media in 2019. So this doesn't have sound. I'm just going to play this in the background while I keep talking. The video was shot by an amateur with a drone in Siberia in the Magadan State Nature Preserve in October of 2018. It entices us with the high quality of the digital recording, the relief of the bear standing out so clearly against the snow-white background, and an episode which, without any staging, strikes us as a dramatic natural story with suspense. Mother bear and cub climb a steep slope. The cub, however, continues to slide down. We don't understand what it is that makes the bear climb this slope. Like in a Hitchcock film, reasons don't matter when the realm of pure suspense, think James Stewart hanging off the roof. We also don't understand the priorities. Would she leave her cub if he was unable to follow? The scene thus observed has on the one hand almost physical, almost mythical qualities, thinks Sisyphus, and on the other hand seems to fit perfectly into a category of narratives Kracauer in theory of film termed, quote, the found story. The term found stories, writes Kracauer, covers all stories found in the material of actual physical reality. Such a found story is part and parcel of the raw material in which it lies dormant, unquote. Are you still listening? These stories have an embryonal quality. Formally, they are like a distillation of something that is already present in the environment, but not in itself visible yet. A certain hidden relationship of elements to one another. The wager of an aesthetic of the barely, contingently, only temporally, the hardly visible, is that it threatens to completely sever our connection to the world, as Stanley Cavell formulated it. Quote, you will all know this quote, photography maintains the presentness of the world by accepting our absence from it. The reality in a photograph is present to me while I am not present to it. And a world I know and see, but to which I am nevertheless not present through no fault of my subjectivity, is a world past, unquote. Between Kracauer and Cavell, one might be able to account for the popularity of videos such as this one, the almost fetishistic, transgressive desire to see a non-human world, to expand beyond our reaches, to fantasize our death. The drone, as disembodied and by now ubiquitous camera technology, plays an important part in this transgressive mediation. Kracauer writes of the, quote, intrinsic beauty of aerial photographs taken with automatic cameras. Like close-ups, he says, they reveal new and unsuspected formations of matter and can blow up our environment by blasting the prison of conventional reality, opening up expanses which we have explored at best in dreams before. In contrast to an airplane camera, the drone's movements, which we as spectators feel and somatically retrace without identifying with it completely, are themselves second-hand movements. The jerky movements of a technical object steered by a human as though it was an avatar. It flies high above the scene, unmanned, disembodied, and almost transcendent perspective. And yet, as some of you might have spotted right away, it is in all likelihood the drone, looking like a dangerous winged predator, and its threateningly noisy motor itself that causes this story in the first place. For a subsequent article in The Atlantic, scientists had analyzed the behavior of the bears in this video and concluded the mother would not have climbed this kind of slope with a cub without the presence of the drone. The moment in which the drone approaches the bears and the cub, almost having reached its mother, slides down again following its mother's paw movement, shows a protective reaction to the drone by the mother bear. This is thus no found story, but a created story. The drone as recording apparatus is part of the story and of the recorded ensemble, the visible and audible environment and the atmosphere of danger pervading the scene. The disturbance by the drone camera itself belies the claim implicit in the video that wilderness and nature beyond mediation can be filmed. The ethical dimension of this problem is thus tied to the suppression of the natural soundtrack, the loud whirring of the drone. The camera's partaking in the scene it captures is an unacknowledged part of the image, a truth obscured by eliminating sound. And here's just an image of somebody operating a drone. During the past 3 months' war in Ukraine, a war coupled with media warfare and hot debates about the truth of army movements, sizes, war crimes, etc., we have had to increasingly rely on drone and satellite images able to relay to us military positions, destruction, and the position of dead bodies. At the same time, drones have become central weapons of destruction, not just reconnaissance. both in the form of official military drones and as retrofitted hobby drones. On May 11th, via Twitter, the Ukrainian army reported the successful defense of its eastern territory by attacking a Russian brigade attempting to cross the Seversky Donets River. The attached drone images bear all the hallmarks of the aerial shots Kracauer describes. Are these images taken with the same apparatus that partook in the destruction visible in them? If so, what do we see through the eyes of a soldier maneuvering this drone avatar? How are we to negotiate objective information, number of tanks, heavy artillery, infrastructure destroyed, with the aesthetic aspect of aerial abstraction, the patterns of natural surfaces and scattered objects? How do we negotiate our perception of the image's alien content with our inner disposition, our allegiance with Ukraine and its plight, our commitment to objective reporting, our pacifism? What is mediated? What does a medium do? And what is a medium? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to introduce our second speaker directly, Johannes von Molte, whose presentation today is titled Kracauers Media Anthropology, is a professor of film, television, and media and of German studies at the University of Michigan. He served as the president of the German Studies Association from 2018 to 2020. His research interests include history and theory of film and new media, as well as critical theory. He is the author and editor of, among other publications, The Curious Humanist, Siegfried Kracauer in America, Culture in the Anteroom, The Legacies of Siegfried Kracauer, and Siegfried Kracauer's Grenzgänger on the Rescue of the Real. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this conference. I've been trying to dredge up a place in Kracauer's letters where he talks about coming back to this Institute for Social Research, with which he had a obviously very complicated relationship, as everybody knows. And I remember the phrase, but I can't remember where it is, but maybe Inga or someone else knows, that where he says, "Nur durch die weit geöffnete Vordertür komme ich wieder in dieses Institut." It's some letter he wrote to somebody, and when I heard about this conference, I thought, okay, here we are. Somebody opened the door wide open, and I love the image of thinking of him as a visitor here and now, and we're all kind of looking at him and who is this person? What does he look like? What does he look like today? Thank you also for pairing Inga and me on this panel, where I think there's a fair bit of overlap to the point where we quote similar passages, but there's also enough distinction, I think, that we have something to talk about. So I will get into Kracauer's media anthropology. And I'll start here. When Raymond Bernard's historical spectacular Le Joueur d'échecs premiered in January of 1927 at the Salle Marivaux in Paris, it met with mixed reviews. Bernard, who'd been hailed as the D.W. Griffith of France after the 1924 success of his Miracle of the Wolves, was celebrated for the new film too by the French press, which wrote "Nous crions bravo," and the French syndicate of cinema directors designated The Chess Player, Le Joueur d'échecs, one of the best films produced in 1926. The foreign press, meanwhile, was nonplussed. Variety gave it a, quote, okay for Europe, but a, quote, nix for the States. And the New York Times called it a rather heavy film featuring uniformly undistinguished performances. A German critic similarly opined that the historical plot and the spectacular scenery were nothing more than average fare, the likes of which one had already seen on screens back home. And yet, this critic discerned in Bernard's film something extraordinary. Writing from Paris for the Frankfurter Zeitung, Siegfried Kracauer, that was the critic, appears to have been mesmerized by the chess player's subject matter, by which he means not the Polish-Russian intrigue or the costume drama that I don't have time to recapitulate here, but the various mechanical figures that populate the film. For the first time on screen, Kracauer marvels, quote, "The chess player represents the terror spread by automata." There are, to be exact, two kinds of automata in the film. On the one hand, we have the Scheinmenschen that so fascinate Kracauer, a menagerie of pseudo-humans. Anthropomorphic in appearance, these automata are mechanical through and through. They look and act like humans, but are activated by levers and presumably operated entirely by cogs and wires. At least that's the conceit. In the story world, these figures are inanimate, humanoid puppets, and none of the characters in the film have any reason to think otherwise. In the pro-filmic world in front of the camera, by contrast, they are flesh and blood actors. And as spectators, we cannot help but look for telltale signs of their human derivation when mechanical movements come across just a bit too fluidly, too organically. It's the opposite of what today one calls the uncanny valley, where a digital animation looks a little bit too jerky for a second. Kracauer was fascinated by exactly this oscillation between the human and the mechanical. He considered the scenes showing von Kempelen's menagerie to be, quote, so perfect that one has the impression as if the human performers of this mechanical household were indeed automata that had developed into humans in turn. Things are a bit different in the case of the titular automaton, the chess player, which is designed as an elaborate ruse and a fairground illusion. Here, too, we have a humanoid mechanical contraption, but where the other pseudo-humans can only move, the chess player can apparently also think. Based on the well-known figure of the Turk, designed by the 18th century Baron von Kempelen, who appears as such in the film, the chess player was less a Scheinmensch than a Scheinautomat, not a pseudo-human, but a pseudo-automaton. For although its chess movements were presumably effectuated by levers, the secret behind the illusion lay in the fact that those levers were operated in turn by a small human hidden inside the mechanism. And a lot of people have written about this, including, of course, Benjamin, but also, very interestingly, Poe in the 19th century. Clearly awed by these machinations, Kracauer writes in his review that, quote, no better theme could have been devised for film. He goes on to justify this superlative by pointing to the isomorphism of automata and cinema. These mechanical figures are so compelling to watch on screen because they owe their life to the same mechanisms as the medium in which they appear, to cranks and sprockets, to effects of light and exposure, to transmission and projection. Little wonder, then, that Kracauer postulates an ontological link between subject matter and medium. Die menschlichen Entschlüsse mögen die Sphäre des Films durchbrechen, der Automat geht bis zum Bodensatz seines Wesens in sie ein. What I translate as the automaton permeates the sphere of film all the way down. With this strange and remarkable formulation, Kracauer moves his review of Bernard's film to a theoretical plane, staking a claim for the cinema's particular admixture of the human and the technological. In varying ways, this is, of course, a key concern of much early and classical film theory as it grapples with the technologization of art and the new medium's place in modernity. Recent scholarship by Jennifer Fay, Katharina Löw, and Inga Pollmann has taken up and tracked these transformations as they ripple out towards conceptions of natural environments, idealist aesthetics, and the notion of life itself. To these Kracauer's formulation here adds what we might describe as a media anthropological perspective. Fascinated by the encounter between human actors and automata in Bernard's film, he draws our attention to the way in which the medium of cinema redefines the very idea of the human as imbricated with technology all the way down. This imbrication has a long history that ranges from the 19th century philosophy of technology through classical film theory to far more recent media anthropology. The central thread that ties together all these different concerns and forms of inquiry is the same concern that jolted Kracauer in response to Bernard's film, a concern with the configuration of the organic and the mechanic, of humans and technology, of anthropos and medium, or of Geist and machine. The chess player encodes for Kracauer a meta-cinematic allegory that we might describe as a media anthropology in its own right, by which I mean the reciprocal constitution of humans and media where neither can quite claim independence or primordiality. Contemporary German media theory after Kittler describes this as anthropomediality, a very German term to English ears, Anthropomedialität. As Kracauer avers, technology permeates the medium of film all the way down, but by decentering human agency and subjectivity, does not do away with them. Instead, from a perspective informed by a critical media anthropology beyond traditional anthropocentrism, the encounter of humans and technology becomes legible as an anthropomedial reconfiguration of mind and matter, the organic and the mechanic. This is the line of thinking that I would like to pursue further in Kracauer's work on film and media. How do Siegfried Kracauer's writings from the 1920s onward reflect that reconfiguration? What would it mean, in other words, to reread Kracauer as a media anthropologist in his own right? I should clarify up front that by speaking of media anthropology, I'm not referring to the ethnographic traditions of visual anthropology, nor am I seeking to link Kracauer's work with anthropological investigations of media use or of media as modern forms of myth or ritual. Though such a perspective would undoubtedly also yield interesting insights into Kracauer's work as an ethnographer of the everyday, my interest here is in placing him in dialogue with a largely Germanophone tradition with roots in philosophical anthropology and media philosophy. I'm interested, in other words, in rereading Kracauer in light of what has been labeled, in English at least, German media theory. More specifically, Kracauer's fascination with the admixture of human and machine in the chess player prompts me to consider his work by looking ahead to the ways in which German media theory would go on to theorize and re-theorize the relationship between media and the human. In the big picture, this prospective view, looking ahead, would necessarily link up with a retrospective assessment of Kracauer's implicit and explicit debts, both to the philosophical anthropology of his day, to Scheler and Plessner, but also to antecedent debates in the philosophy of technology and the incipient field of film theory, the line that would run from Ernst Kapp to Hugo Münsterberg. While I won't have time today to explore these genealogies and their various contributions to thinking through the relationship of humans and technological media, they certainly continue to resonate in the background of more specifically media anthropological investigations in recent years. Spearheaded by scholars such as Christiane Voss, Lorenz Engel, Bernhard Siegert, and others, contemporary media anthropology considers the human to be inextricably bound up with media. In a marked departure from Kittler's media determinism, the emphasis here is on the imbrication, or now I would actually say Einstülpung, the imbrication of medium and anthropos, concepts of the human, of life, or of the organic that had grounded an earlier philosophical anthropology, think of Plessner's Stufen des Organischen, can no longer be posited as foundational. But neither is it sufficient to simply turn the tables on the so-called human, as Kittler did, by blankly asserting that, quote, media determine our situation. Instead, the new media anthropology aims to subsume both traditions, philosophical anthropology, and media philosophy, under the guiding concept of anthropomediality. A neologism and theoretical construct in its own right, the notion of anthropomediality posits a constitutive relationality of humans and media that logically precedes the very distinction between the two. So, instead of asserting a one-sided medial a priori and conceptualizing the so-called human, always in quotation marks, as produced by techniques of harmonization, Christiane Voss and others prefer to speak of Mensch-Medien-Verschränkungen, or imbrications, or Einstülpungen. As Voss puts it, quote, the still new field of media anthropology centers the question of medial and media technical contingencies, and hence the relationality of human forms of existence. The project of a media anthropology is deliberately capacious, spanning not just technical media, nor just the subset of audiovisual and print media that long constituted the purview of media studies. Instead, media anthropology inherits from media philosophy an understanding of media as a wide set of operations, such as mediation and distinction, distribution and storage, production and exchange, as well as the material basis for these various operations, whether these be the camera or the postal system. And to this list now I would also add mood and environment and Stimmung, milieu. That said, the cinema does play a central role in the work of some key proponents of the new media anthropology, such as Christiane Voss and Lorenz Engel, whose own origins, whether by training or as the focus of their earlier work, lay with the study of film. Engel consequently attributes a particular anthropomedial dimension to film, which he locates in the medium's, quote, conception, indeed its embodiment, of life in its relation to the mechanical. And yet, the emerging field has paid scant attention to the classical texts of film theory and aesthetics, at times even dismissing them outright for their ostensibly one-sided attention to technology and the object world at the expense of the human. Such a claim is difficult to reconcile, however, with a countervailing interest throughout the history of classical film theory in precisely the anthropomedial concern with the imbrication of technology and art, object and humans, medium and anthropos. From Münsterberg onwards, film theorists have repeatedly posed the question how these fundamental entanglements recalibrate our very notion of what it means to be human. My overarching aim in this respect would be to reread the texts of classical film theory as contributions in their own right, if avant la lettre, to a media anthropology. My hope is that this might help shed new light on classical texts, but also to redress lacuna and trace overlooked histories relevant to contemporary media anthropological research. In this effort, I find Kracauer to be a somewhat surprisingly constructive guide. Given my time, I can't develop this line of inquiry in full detail, but I'd like to spotlight a few points in Kracauer's writings at which I see the media anthropological thread moving into the foreground of his multifarious interests in media, culture, and society. These moments include his early film criticism with its predilection for slapstick, his celebrated Weimar-era essays on photography or the mass ornament, his notes on film aesthetics from the 1930s and 40s, the full-fledged theory of film that he ultimately published in 1960, and in a more speculative vein, his posthumous book on history, about which we heard a lot yesterday. I can only touch on each of these very briefly, but we'll linger a little bit on the photography essay that Inga also talked about, and on the Marseille notebooks, to show how Kracauer's complex media anthropological thinking might work in action. So, first, slapstick. This is a caricature from a series of essays on film critics in the Filmkurier in the 1930s. I love this image of him. Any reader of Kracauer's 1920s film and cultural criticism will quickly notice his predilection for slapstick, a genre, if not an underlying mode of cinema, that Kracauer celebrates time and again for its sheer vibrancy, for its emphasis on speed and motion, and for the primacy of the object world. In slapstick, Kracauer avers, humans are routinely decentered, their intentions foiled by the recalcitrance of inanimate objects, die Tücke des Objekts. Early reviews thus contain the seeds of a line of thought, if not an entire theory of film, that subsequent critics have identified as Kracauer's own. His thinking through things, as Dorothee Kimmich analyzed it, and his non-anthropocentric worldview that Miriam Hansen in particular spent a lot of time unpacking. In slapstick, in other words, the cinema powerfully decenters the human through the mediated encounter with that which is not human, whether, quote, the entire mechanized world of modernity, that's Kracauer, the material world of props and natural environments, or the sheer superhuman speed that Kracauer considers characteristic of the genre and that might have had something to do with the speed of cranking the camera or the projector. Most palpable in his predilection for slapstick, Kracauer's Weimar film criticism is acutely attuned, in other words, to the reconfiguration of humanist assumptions about intention, about meaning, and about spirit in the encounter with the new medium. Although Kracauer clearly considers slapstick to be paradigmatic for the cinema, it is of course only a genre among others, and the references in the reviews do not yet amount really to a full-fledged theory of the medium. That is something he does attempt in the justly famous 1927 essay on photography. Readers of the essay will recall that Kracauer here stages an encounter between humans and technology in terms of a battle between medium and memory. Photography, he argues at first, threatens to dethrone memory and replace it with a positivistic inventory of the visible. The medium fundamentally rearranges the relation between nature and humanity, threatening to displace the human and reinstate a second nature, which is that of technology. On this reading, photography is memory without meaning, without Sinn. As such, it poses a profound challenge to the received humanist categories that also appear to drive Kracauer's investigation. The terms all appear across his writings: reason, truth, consciousness, Bewusstsein or Geist, even redemption, Erlösung. Photography appears precisely as what is inhuman, what is left after human essence has been evacuated. Quote, what appears in the photograph is not the person, der Mensch, but the sum of what can be subtracted from him or her. The photograph annihilates the person, den Menschen. In a characteristic dialectical twist, however, Kracauer's essay concludes on the reversal of its media pessimism, noting that the rise and near suffocating spread of photography also presents an unparalleled chance, as Inga already explained. For it conveys more forcefully than humanist critique would be able the stakes of the encounter between humans and media technology, which can end either in the annihilation of the human by the medium, or in a second-order consciousness of modernity's looming endgame, of alienation, reification, and the replacement of Vernunft by purely instrumental rationality, ratio. This is what Kracauer describes as the culmination of at the culmination of his essay as the famous go-for-broke game, the Va-banque-Spiel of history, a hyperbolic formulation to be sure, but one that recognizes the irreversible imbrication of humans and media. And so I'm inclined to describe the second-order consciousness that photography enables as a media consciousness, in the sense that it is mediated by photography and is itself a medium of the reconfiguration of humans and technology. A few years earlier, Béla Balázs had coined the term kurbelndes Bewusstsein, translated into real consciousness with two E's in the Promise of Cinema volume. Balázs had coined the term kurbelndes Bewusstsein to account for a similar media historical transformation. For both of these critics, the technological media of photography and film show the Naturfundament of consciousness, as Kracauer calls it. Photography blasts open the continuum of memory and shows human faculties to be contingent upon media. Lest I create the impression that photographic reproduction now becomes a medial a priori in the sense in which Kittler would later talk of the gramophone, of film, and the typewriter, I hasten to point out that consciousness, and with it Kittler's so-called human, is fully erased only in one outcome of the go-for-broke game. That scenario does foresee the triumph of photography, and by extension of technological media, over the human. Should this come to pass, this is a formulation you probably all know well, quote, the emancipation of consciousness would result in the eradication of consciousness. The nature that it failed to penetrate would sit down at the very table that consciousness had abandoned, end of quote. Consciousness has left the table, the medium has taken its place. Kittler couldn't have said it better. But Kracauer leaves room for the alternative. One in which consciousness passes through the medium and comes out liberated on the other side, less enmeshed, as he writes, in the natural bonds than ever before. The promise of a media consciousness that transforms but leaves room for the human, or for what Kracauer will later call the humane, is a central motif in Kracauer's thinking from the Weimar era of the photography essay through his posthumous thoughts on the camera reality of history. We can further observe this thinking taking shape in the notes he took for his aesthetics of film during the 1940s. And here I turn to the Marseille notebooks, which, by the way, are also New York notebooks and even Nyassa notebooks. Kracauer records conversations he has with Schifftan on the boat over, on the Nyassa, on the transatlantic trip. And there are notes that he takes in New York as well. I obviously think this is somewhat significant. That's not I mean, I'm not disputing that the notebook was written, started in Marseille, but since it's such a, layered palimpsest of writing, it's interesting to note that in the very early pages, there are notes that clearly come from his days in New York and on the boat. On the cusp of leaving Europe for the United States, Kracauer will again zoom in on the medium to which he had devoted such sustained attention as a reviewer during the Weimar years. Among other aspects yet to be explored in the Marseille notebooks is the methodical fashion in which Kracauer seems to clear out the debris of older humanist frameworks for thinking about the new medium. Clarifying for himself that the cinema remains inadequately conceptualized if grounded in aesthetic, sociopolitical, or hermeneutic approaches, Kracauer sounds a distinctly Benjaminian note when he writes, by marking the turn to materiality and thereby grasping for the first time in history the entire world of motion, film brings consciousness and our sensorium auf den Stand der Technik, in line with technology. Miriam Hansen was the first to direct our attention to the importance of these notebooks, not just as prolegomena for the theory of film, but also in their own right. And just as Hansen turned to these notebooks to restore the history in and of Kracauer's film theory, I propose we might return to them for the media anthropological needle that he threads in these pages. As he repeatedly encircles the question of how to conceptualize cinema's characteristic mediation of consciousness and technology, Kracauer seems deeply invested in, quote, rendering visible the relay points between the human and the non-human, a formulation that I take not from his notebooks, but from a programmatic summation of media anthropology, rendering visible the relay points between the human and the non-human. Identifying these relay points, Engel and Siegert insist, involves a, quote, relentless movement of decentering the human in recognition of the fact that old subject-centered concepts no longer hold, and that agency is distributed equally across humans and non-human media objects and technologies. For them, the human is consequently, quote, relational and always already embedded in a medial field, a media sphere, a media habitat. In several respects, the Marseille notebooks trace out both of these operations, the decentering and the medial embedding of the human. The first of these movements carries over from the early fascination with slapstick and forms a motif across all of Kracauer's film theory, as Hansen in particular reminds us. It is variously a movement through things and away from intention, from meaning, from art, and hence from the human. As Kracauer puts it in a particularly compelling notation, film is, quote, indifferent towards objects, that is, non-anthropocentric. And yet, film is anthropoetic, as today's media anthropologists might put it. From this medium, and in the encounter with it, the figure of the human emerges even as it is incessantly decentered. Recall the formulation that so fascinated Hansen that she gave her article, the quotation as a title, namely that film, according to Kracauer, ergreift den Menschen mit Haut und Haaren. It seizes the human with skin and hair. The implications of this phrase are twofold. On the one hand, rather than subjectivity or consciousness, it stresses the bodily physicality of the human as what Kracauer calls a corporeal material being. On the other hand, the German idiom, mit Haut und Haaren, unlike the English translation, I think, signifies absoluteness and totality. Film seizes the human completely and without remainder, like a bear eating something, mit Haut und Haaren. There's nothing left. In the encounter with the medium, humans are all in. Notably, Kracauer is speaking here neither of the spectator, nor of the actor, nor of any particular positionality, but of a medial human, what he calls der dem Film zugeordnete Mensch. The human coordinated with film, we might translate. This human is always already embedded in the medial field. It is a media anthropological figure that film brings forth and decenters in a dynamic relation. Der dem Film zugeordnete Mensch ist dynamisch und wird durch die Darstellung des Materiellen als körperlich materielles Wesen erfasst. Das Ich des dem Film zugeordneten Menschen ist in ständiger Auflösung begriffen. Though Hansen rightly draws out the fine distinctions in nuance and emphasis between the work envisaged in the Marseille notebooks and its final shape 20 years later in Theory of Film, it's also worth noting how much of the completed book is already recognizable in the columns of notes that Kracauer assembled fastidiously in Marseille, on the Nyassa, and in New York. Thus, even as physical reality eventually replaces materiality in the finished book, and history becomes doubly displaced, as Hansen has shown, the media anthropological perspective that I've been describing arguably remains. If anything, that perspective now frames the specific questions of style and medium that Kracauer discusses throughout Theory of Film. As he himself puts it, the book sets cinema, quote, in the perspective of something more general, an approach to the world, a mode of human existence. In this regard, as Kracauer will write 20 years later in Theory of Film, quote, the cinema, I'm sorry, as he'll write not later, in the same book, in A Theory of Film, the cinema is not exclusively human. Its subject matter is the infinite flux of visible phenomena, those ever-changing patterns of physical existence whose flow may include human manifestations, but need not climax in them. The cinema, which, quote, does not differentiate between humans and inanimate objects, end of quote, redefines the very notion of the human by decentering it and situating it in the, quote, endless continuum of physical existence. Let me conclude this series of snapshots on an even more speculative note and ask how we might reread Kracauer's posthumous work on history in light of the media anthropological concerns we've traced in his writings up through Theory of Film. For the history book centers, as Kracauer himself puts it, on a, quote, fundamental analogy between historiography and the photographic media. The historian, we heard this yesterday a couple of times, should treat the archive in the same way in which photographers and filmmakers treat reality. But what if the analogy, about which he has really interesting marks as well, analogical reasoning, but what if the analogy hides a deeper anthropological shift? What if the reference to camera reality is not simply an epistemic device in an argument about historiography, but rather an implicit affirmation of mediation as that which shapes our grasp of the world in the first place? What if, after cinema, reality is camera reality in a way that no longer permits us to subtract either the technological or the human from the premises on which that reality is constituted. This, in a way, had been one projected outcome of the go-for-broke game with history already in the essay on photography, which Kracauer, of course, invokes in the posthumous book as well. And it's difficult to overlook the ways in which our own algorithmic culture, the immersive mediascapes of virtual reality, and the looming metaverse appear to render Kracauer's Zeitdiagnose of 1927 eerily predictive, an all-encompassing reality, media reality. Such a conclusion should give us pause, though, for at least two reasons. First, in history, in the book, Kracauer himself warns of the undue presentism which could lead us to impose our hypermediated present on a media historical past. Second, and more importantly, the media anthropological perspectives that I've outlined decidedly do not culminate in the unalloyed triumph of technology, the victory of machine and medium over consciousness and the human. Such a conclusion would be at odds both with Kracauer's writings and with far more recent media theory that insists precisely on the, quote, elastic relationality of human modes of existence in relation to media. As Christiane Voss summarizes the project, the refutation of an earlier anthropology's anthropocentrism should not give rise to a, quote, complementary media theoretical cynicism that celebrates the end of the human and triumphantly heralds computing technologies. In other words, and to reiterate one of our starting points, between outdated humanist essentialisms and Hitlerian determinism, media anthropology charts a middle path. By attending to the relay points between the human and the non-human, as Engel and Siegert would have it, a media anthropological approach, quote, replaces the strict separation of the human from the non-human with their constitutive mutual imbrication. And it's just that imbrication, we recall, that so fascinated Kracauer in the treatment of automata and the chess player, whose spectacular ending I would like to offer in closing now to emblematize the recursive movement between media and technologies and decentered humans that we found to characterize some of Kracauer's writings. At the end of Bernard's film, the titular chess-playing contraption has been shot by the Imperial Guard in a grand ceremony. The entire, because it's won against Catherine the Great, and that, of course, can't be let stand. So the automaton needs to be shot. The entire court revels in the spectacle until a member of the party suddenly realizes that, quote, the automaton is bleeding. And everyone recoils in horror at the mechanism signs of organic life. The illusion of machine mastery is unveiled, and the mind in the machine is revealed to have been human after all, as its inventor emerges from the Turk, and we see his life expire in a stunning sequence of subjective vision. And like Inga, at the risk of distracting you from what I have to say about it, I'm going to let this run in the back and tell you what I think about it. This scene brings together the concerns of the film with automation, projection, illusion, and the human mind. Edited to invoke a sense that we are peering both into a clock-like apparatus and into von Kempelen's soul, which turn out to be the same thing, the sequence offers us one last automaton, a representation of death. Here it is. Half skeleton and half robot, the figure advances toward von Kempelen until he attempts to grasp it in an optical point of view shot that features his own hands in ghostly superimposition. I'll wait for that to happen. Film, Kracauer notes down in Marseille, does not aim upward toward intention, but pushes toward the bottom. It is interested in refuse, in what is just there, both in and outside the human being. The face counts for nothing in film, unless it includes the death's head beneath. Like Eisenstein's work in Mexico that inspired this note, Bernard's film explicitly develops this allegory. But Bernard replaces Eisenstein's ethnographic gaze with a media anthropological one that extends the allegory into the uncanny valley of lifeless automata, performed so persuasively by human actors that Kracauer reads them inversely as well, as automata that had developed into humans in turn. For Kracauer, we said, these automata were isomorphic with cinema, which they permeate all the way down. But at its extremes, pure externality can flip into its opposite. A machine can have a soul. Similarly, the automaton of death externalizes von Kempelen's final innermost vision, but the opposite is also true. At the heart of subjectivity, we find a mechanical object. Peering with von Kempelen at his own death, the final sequence of the chess player opens the door to a hall of mirrors, or if you will, a series of nesting Russian dolls that alternate between the human and the mechanical. Inside the humanoid chess player sat a flesh and blood human, whose innermost domain turns out to be a clockwork, inhabited by another mechanical figure, which, like the other automata in the film, was portrayed by a human actor before being superimposed onto the multiply layered, mechanically produced image. It is this regress of automata and humans that I would ultimately want to reclaim as the film's allegory for cinema. An anthropomedial, nested structure of technological affordances and human agency that radically decenters the latter, but constantly returns to it as well. If the automaton allegorizes the cinema, this image will always include another dwarf in the machine. In Kracauers media anthropology, humans and technology permeate each other all the way down. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We would like to change to German for the discussion. Is there anyone in the audience or maybe in the stream that would prefer the discussion to be in English? No. Okay. Gut, dann werden wir auf Deutsch wechseln und ich möchte euch gerne erst die Möglichkeit geben, aufeinander zu reagieren.
Reagierst du erst, während ich mich noch sortiere? Was? Reagierst du erst, während ich mich noch sortiere?
Ja, mache ich. Funktioniert das? Ja. Ja, also das haben wir ja schon im Vorfeld festgestellt, dass es da ganz viele Korrespondenzen gibt zwischen unseren Vorträgen und mich würde jetzt eigentlich, also mich würden sowohl die Ähnlichkeiten als auch die Differenzen interessieren. Und zwar habe ich das Gefühl, dass bei dir diese Idee von dieser Imbrication of human and media, human and technology, dass das sozusagen die zentrale Frage ist. Was genau ist denn die Form dieser Imbrication? Was für eine Form nimmt die an? Weil davon hängt ja auch sozusagen diese Unterscheidung ab, die du dann machst zwischen Medienanthropologie und sozusagen Kittlers Medientheorie. Und in einem zweiten Schritt wäre sozusagen die Frage für mich, in was für einem Verhältnis siehst du dann diese Imbrication und sozusagen diese Elastizität, weil das ist ja auch zentral, dass es sozusagen, dass es kein stabiles Verhältnis ist, dass es nicht darum geht, auf einer stabilen Identität von also einer essentiellen Menschsein zu beharren, sondern sozusagen ein elastisches Verständnis von Menschsein oder Menschlichkeit zu entwerfen, das also sozusagen auch eine gewisse Art von Resistenz hat. Und da ist natürlich auch die Frage nach der Natur dieser Elastizität. Wie elastisch kann das denn sein? Wann überschreitet man die Grenze? Wie verhält sich das vielleicht auch zu Theorien des Posthumanen? Und wie kann man das verbinden? Ich habe in meinem Vortrag eher über diese Idee von Vermittlung gesprochen. Und das ist eigentlich ja was ganz Ähnliches. Aber wenn du noch mal dazu was sagen könntest, das würde mich interessieren.
Ja, ich hatte auch über den Vermittlungsbegriff nochmal nachgedacht, weil er auch gestern erwähnt wurde und da im Zusammenhang mit Dialektik. Ja, ob Kracauer, das Kracauer, also das ist ja so ein Topos, den wir, also ich auch, aber der mir auch immer wieder gegenüber wiederholt wurde, Kracauer ist kein Dialektiker. In dem Sinne, dass er eben dieses Side-by-Side-Prinzip hat am Ende in der Geschichte, wo die Dinge nicht vermittelt werden. Da bin ich immer ein bisschen skeptisch, also natürlich, da ist es explizit, aber dann denke ich, dann muss man auch zurückgehen in die Formulierungen und die Chiasmen der Essays, die wirklich also zutiefst dialektisch angelegt sind für meine Begriffe. Also ich denke nicht, dass man einfach sagen kann, er ist kein dialektischer Denker. Und insofern ist der Zusammenhang zwischen dialektischer Vermittlung und Medien als Mediation für mich relativ wichtig. Also ich glaube, da gibt es mehr Korrespondenzen, als wir eben meistens einräumen. Die Formen, die diese Mensch-Medien-Verschränkungen oder Einstülpungen annehmen, sind einerseits wohl einzelne Filme, wie der Schachspieler, ja, oder wobei ich habe bei den Bären habe ich überlegt, wie würden diese Bären jetzt reinpassen in diese Idee, also weil in dem Fall ja, da bin ich noch nicht weitergekommen. Also ich finde dieses Bärenbeispiel faszinierend und denke, dass du da auch schon ziemlich viel zu gesagt hast, also wie das Medium sich einerseits als posthuman gibt und gleichzeitig gesteuert ist und die Geschichte überhaupt erst kreiert. Also das wäre wieder so eine Verschränkungsfigur, denke ich. Ja, das erstmal. Was mir beim Zuhören bei dir als Frage kam und dann auch beim Vorlesen selber habe ich weiter darüber nachgedacht, ist die Frage, das ist vielleicht auch also nicht eine Antwort auf deine Frage nach Elastizität, aber einfach eine Weiterführung. Wie weit wir bereit sind oder wie weit Kracauer bereit ist zu gehen oder wie weit wir gehen sollten mit Kracauer oder nach Kracauer in Bezug auf Mediation als so ein Konzept, was ja, also wie total das Konzept ist. Weil wenn, also ich habe ziemlich verallgemeinernd davon geredet, aber doch immer in Bezug auf technische Medien. Du weitest es jetzt auf Stimmung, Lindenpassage, Umwelten und die Frage, die dann im Raum steht, denke ich, auf die ich jetzt keine direkte Antwort habe, aber es ist vielleicht eine Frage an dich. Also die Frage wäre, gibt es einen Rest? Wenn alles Vermittlung wird, wenn alles medial wird. Ja? Zumal mit Blick auf Kracauers, also für ihn ist ja auch, also Natur, da hast du viel zu sagen gehabt, ist nicht der Rest. Ne? Natur ist immer schon in den Medien drin und die Errettung der äußeren Wirklichkeit, die gibt es auch nicht per se als Ding an sich, sondern auch eigentlich nur durch den Film. Deswegen schreibt er die Filmtheorie. Also insofern wäre die Frage, ob es das Vorgängige vor der Vermittlung noch gibt oder ob diese Verschränktheit tatsächlich so total ist, dass selbst bei einem Kracauer, bei dem einem das also nicht auf den ersten Blick auffällt, also beim Schreiben und Nachdenken habe ich auch gedacht, das ist doch eigentlich überraschend, dass man über Kracauer auch so nachdenken kann, denn das wäre nicht mein erster Zugang gewesen, aber es war irgendwie was, wo ich dachte, also seitdem ich in dem Titel von dem Buch einen wunderlichen Humanisten genannt habe, habe ich immer gedacht, das musst du dir schon nochmal erklären. Und also da kommt es so ein bisschen her. Aber das wäre eine Rückfrage an dich. Also wie total ist dieser Medienbegriff bei Kracauer eigentlich? Deins heißt einfach Kracauers Medium, ne? Dein Vortrag.
Davon war ich aber selber überrascht, weil das habe ich mir irgendwann vor 2 Jahren ausgedacht. Und als ich mich dann dem Vortrag wieder zuwandte, merkte ich, dass es dafür schon einen Titel gab. Ich will dazu jetzt nur kurz was sagen, weil ich würde es dann auch gerne öffnen. Ich glaube, dass der Vermittlungsbegriff funktioniert ja eigentlich nur, wenn zwischen 2 Dingen vermittelt wird. Also wenn sozusagen das Medium auch die Mitte ist zwischen zwei Polen. Und ich glaube, es geht mir eigentlich eher darum, dass diese Pole sich in Bewegung befinden. Also du hast ja auch mehrere Zitate gehabt, also diese Idee von dieser Bewegung, in die der Mensch oder das menschliche gerät, in dieser Verschränkung mit der Technik. Und das Gleiche gilt, glaube ich, auch für sozusagen die Umwelt, ja, dass die genauso in Bewegung geraten ist. Und das heißt, wir haben also diese 3 Pole sozusagen, Technik und Mensch und Umwelt, die alle unglaublich dynamisch sich immer wieder neu verschränken. Aber die Differenzen, ich glaube, und darum geht es dir ja eigentlich auch, wenn du diese Medienanthropologie stark machst, die Differenzen bleiben erhalten und ohne die kann Kracauer auch nicht denken.
Gut, vielen Dank. Dann gibt es Fragen aus dem Publikum. Ja, gibt es ein Mikro?
Ja, also vielen Dank für die Vorträge. Johannes, ich habe eine Frage an dich. Also natürlich ist der Film kein anthropozentrisches Medium, er ist sozusagen ein dezidiert nicht anthropozentrisches Medium für Kracauer. Aber ist sein Denken nicht anthropozentrisch? Also das ist doch ein Unterschied. Also sozusagen, ich würde sagen, dass das, was du jetzt am Film herausgestellt hast, sich doch eigentlich in eine, also wenn man jetzt sozusagen doch übergreifende Bewegung sozusagen dieses Denkens verbinden lässt und dass es immer diese Figur, das hat er mal, also in der Frühphase formuliert er das sozusagen kulturpessimistisch, also wir sind gewissermaßen alle in einer Fremde angelangt. Ja? Wir sind alle in einer, man könnte sagen, wir sind alle Juden geworden. Ne? Das ist ja so ein bisschen am Anfang schon ein Motiv. Ja? Also es gibt Traditionsverluste, es gibt Transzendenzverluste, es gibt Herkunftsverluste, also Verlust, einfach kein besseres Wort, es gibt diese Brüche, ja, auf allen Ebenen. Und der Dreh ist ja irgendwie, ich forciere einfach jetzt mal sozusagen alle Möglichkeiten, diese Welt zu sehen. Alle Möglichkeiten, die ich habe, diese Welt zu sehen. Und weil das ist unsere Welt. Ja, das ist im emphatischen Sinne unsere Welt. Und der Film sozusagen lässt uns gewissermaßen in dieser, blöd gesagt, Fremde ankommen. Also das sind natürlich am Ende diese Motive, die ihr mit Auerbach teilt und die am Ende sozusagen in Theory of Film formuliert werden. Und deshalb wäre meine Frage, also das Medium ist nicht anthropozentrisch, leuchtet mir absolut ein, aber gilt das für sein Denken? Und da wäre ich sozusagen skeptisch.
Beide im Prinzip erkennbar. Ja, ich müsste einen Moment drüber nachdenken. Also, was für einen Unterschied würde es machen, diese Unterscheidung aufzumachen? Ja.
Ein Unterschied wäre, dass er den Film nochmal in anderer Weise als Medium denkt. Nämlich als Medium sozusagen uns gewissermaßen in dieser Welt ankommen zu lassen.
Ja, also ich kann im Augenblick nur sagen, den Verdacht teile ich auf jeden Fall. Also ich glaube, er schreibt sich ja, das ist ja auch für Benjamin so und das gilt für alle diese, also die sind sehr unterschiedlich, diese frühen Filmtheoretiker, aber das habe ich versucht zu sagen, die arbeiten sich alle an, mit dem Gepäck ihrer humanistischen Bildung, das aus dem Gymnasium im 19. und frühen 20. Jahrhundert kommt, arbeiten sie sich alle ab. Er arbeitet sich aber doch daran ab, oder? Also es muss erstmal alles wegerklärt werden oder alles erklärt werden, was von bestimmten Ideen des Menschen herkommt. Und dann würde ich auch sagen, klar, also das Motiv ist auch wieder das Motiv der Entnaturalisierung oder wie immer man es, oder Verfremdung, wie immer man es beschreiben will. Und dafür ist der Film das Medium. Das denke ich auch, auch bei Kracauer, aber auch sowas wie der Roman. Ne? Also das passiert natürlich auch in Ginster auf seine Weise. Aber ich müsste noch ein bisschen drüber nachdenken, wo wirklich die Unterscheidung ist, also was das am Medium dann macht, wenn der Denker in anderer Hinsicht anthropozentrisch denkt, aber trotzdem diese Verschränkung doch in das Zentrum seiner Medien, also eben auch der Fotografietheorie, denke ich, rückt.
Ich bin mir auch nicht so sicher, also das ist ja auch nicht ohne Rest, also es ist ja nicht so, dass man dann wirklich in der Fremde ankommt, also Kracauer kommt ja auch irgendwie nie richtig an und das zieht sich ja eigentlich durch alle seine Texte und ich glaube, dass man vielleicht genau in dieser Unmöglichkeit in der Fremde anzukommen, die aber überall ist, also dass sich da sozusagen in diesem Zwischenraum auch wieder das Medium behauptet.
Es gibt 2 Fragen hier vorne und dann anschließend Felix Trautmann. Achso, oder da hinten gibt es auch direkt noch eine. Okay, dann können wir die zuerst nehmen, dann die 2 vorne und anschließend.
Also wenn das okay ist.
Ja, in Ordnung.
Also vielen Dank. Also das wollte ich eigentlich gar nicht fragen. Ich sage es nur ganz kurz als Kommentar. Das Ankommen in der Fremde, da ist Kracauer natürlich schon besonders, weil er sehr früh anfängt, auf Englisch zu schreiben. Und zwar nach ein paar holprigen Anfangsjahren sehr elegant, sehr klar. Ja, und das unterscheidet ihn von manchen anderen Emigre-Scholars seiner Generation. Okay, ich wollte das auch ein bisschen erweitern noch nach der Frage, nach der Bedeutung von politischen Dingen in all diesem Kontext. Ne? Also wahnsinnig anregende Vorträge, ich denke über vieles noch nach, aber ganz banal am Ende des Textes über den Abschied von der Lindenpassage sagt er ja, der Durchgang ist auch der Durchgang zu etwas, wir wissen es nicht genau, wahrscheinlich in Anführungszeichen oder so ähnlich zum Faschismus. Und wenn man dann an Begriff wie Stimmung, Atmosphäre oder so denkt, dann kann man natürlich einerseits sagen, okay, das ist Sein und Zeit und Heidegger und so lesen die meisten deutschen Kulturwissenschaftler heute den Begriff, aber vermutlich hatte Kracauer natürlich Simmel im Kopf, der sich sehr ausführlich in den späten Schriften über Geschichte und Zeit zu Fragen von Färbung und Stimmung geäußert hat. Ne? Und dann kann man anfangen, damit zu spielen und dann hat man auch so einen Kontext wie den Geist der Gesetze bei Montesquieu, was ja auch auf eine bestimmte Stimmung abhebt. Oder späte Schriften von Karl Mannheim über demokratische Persönlichkeit kreisen über Dinge, die man als demokratische Stimmung beschreiben kann. Ne? Das sind alles Dinge, die dann grundlegend sind, aber wahnsinnig schwer fassbar. So, das ist der erste Kommentar. Und die zweite Frage ist viel banaler. Jemand, der mir da auch sofort einfällt, weil Kracauer eben, ja, war da jetzt Teil der Frankfurter Schule oder nicht? Er war in jedem Fall Teil der Frankfurter Zeitung. Und wenn er Teil der Frankfurter Zeitung war, gehört er eben in einen Kontext mit Leuten wie Bernhard Gutmann, Benno Reifenberg und natürlich Dolf Sternberger. Und Sternbergers politisches Feuilleton ist auch ein Feuilleton, das danach versucht, irgendwie die Bedeutung von schwer fassbaren Dingen für politische Fragen zu begreifen. Das Panoramabuch, das Heine-Buch aus der Zeit des NS. Und dann immer wieder auch, genau wie bei Kracauer, das Nachdenken über Chaplin und Slapstick und die Bedeutung von Chaplin und Slapstick für ein demokratisches Zusammenleben. Ich weiß ehrlich gesagt nicht, ob jemand das mal systematisch untersucht hat, aber es ist eine interessante quasi Parallele, auch wenn Sternberger natürlich viele Jahre jünger ist als 20 Jahre jünger ist als Kracauer. Danke.
Ich kann, also das sind jetzt alles anregende Ideen für uns alle zum Weiterdenken. Deswegen habe ich jetzt gar nicht so viel dazu zu sagen, außer vielleicht nochmal, was ich nur ganz kurz jetzt erwähnt habe im Vortrag, dass natürlich dieses, ja, so Begriffe wie Stimmung, dass es ganz bewusst auch so ein bisschen eine Provokation ist und dass alles, was irgendwie in Verbindung steht mit Lebensphilosophie, da jemand wie Kracauer natürlich dann irgendwann auch sehr, sehr vorsichtig sozusagen mit den Begriffen umgegangen sind. Und dass ich das Gefühl habe, dass in Kracauers Texten da aber so eine andere Art und Weise mit dieser Legacy umzugehen aufscheint. Und das interessiert mich.
Gut, dann weiter. Ich würde Sie bitten, die Fragen eher kurz zu halten mit Blick auf die Zeit, dass noch alle drankommen.
Ja, ich fand es sehr interessant, dass ihr beide in den Vorträgen sich so stark mit dem Todesmotiv abgearbeitet habt. Und Inga macht das ja mit Cavell und bei Kracauer kann man das natürlich auch, also du hast es ja nochmal besonders stark über die Bildsymbolik auch reingebracht. Ich meine, führt es nicht auf ein anderes Problem? Führt es nicht auf ein anderes Problem der Remediatisierung, wenn man so will? Ich glaube, wir sind uns einig, dass es bei Kracauer mit der Errettung der Wirklichkeit ein Modell des Aufhebens gibt. Also eben eine Rettung, ne, eine Errettung. Und die wird ja erstmal sozusagen, also durch diese enorme Herstellung eines Archivs oder vielleicht sogar einfach nur eines Storage oder so, eines Lagerraums eingerichtet. Und ich glaube, das entbindet aber nicht davon, dass im Hintergrund natürlich diese Frage sich andeutet, wie werden denn diese leeren Hülle, also das, was sozusagen übrig bleibt, wenn man, ihr habt gesagt, die Person oder den Menschen aus den Klamotten und den Knochen abzieht, dann bleiben eben irgendwie also diese Phantombilder, die nichts anderes zeigen als das, was sozusagen als im wortwörtlichsten Sinne als physischer Abdruck übrig bleibt, wenn die Person schon längst gestorben ist. Da stellt sich natürlich die Frage, also wenn man das sozusagen betrachtet als eine Ansammlung toter Materie, dann ergibt sich natürlich fast unmittelbar die Frage nicht nur der Remediatisierung, sondern der Resemiotisierung. Und ist nicht sozusagen, also das im Grunde, also wenn man so will, also Kracauers negative Heilsgeschichte, dass wir über diese Resemiotisierung noch nicht verfügen. Wir können es noch nicht benennen. Und deswegen bleiben wir sozusagen erstmal an diesen Hüllen kleben. Aber ich glaube nicht, dass man es jetzt in der Medienanthropologie so verstehen sollte, dass das eine Unterscheidung macht zwischen sozusagen einem Medium des Toten oder der toten Materie, also sozusagen der ahuman oder posthuman oder transhuman oder was auch immer. Und dagegen wird dann sozusagen gesetzt, also dieses sich Entziehende der Person, des Lebens und so weiter. Ich glaube, dass es bei Kracauer schon so gedacht ist, dass am Ende steht doch diese Aufforderung, und das wäre vielleicht dann auch die politische Frage, was machen wir denn mit unserer Geschichte? Und das ist, glaube ich, auch was Film in dem Sinne, also bestimmt ja irgendwie unser Verhältnis zur Zeit. Also das ist sozusagen eine neue Anthropologie, die da auftaucht, dass wir permanent gezwungen sind, uns mit uns selbst als sozusagen toter Materie zu beschäftigen. Und das kann nicht irgendwie ein Ziel an sich sein. Und insofern finde ich das interessant, dass diese Figur des Zwischenstadiums, des Durchgangs, und da würde ich sagen, ist natürlich Film für ihn eigentlich auch eher so ein Durchgangslager. Aber es ist kein Endzustand. Ne? Also die Errettung steht noch aus. Ne? Das ist nur die Bedingung der Möglichkeit.
Also erstmal vielen Dank, thanks a lot. Ich muss auch drüber nachdenken und vor allen Dingen muss ich als Anglistin, Amerikanistin und Romanistin alles nochmal anschauen. weil es war doch einiges ja, Interessante und Schwierige auch dabei. Ganz kurz 2 Punkte. Sie haben ja mehrere Autorinnen und Autoren genannt, unter anderem auch oder insbesondere auch Miriam Hansen. Also Hansen und Schlübmann waren meine ersten Filmlehrerinnen, muss ich sagen. Ja. Und ich habe Frau Hansen auch als sehr, sehr fokussierte Studentin kennengelernt. Also die war etwas über mir. Ja, sehr interessant. Also welchen Stellenwert hat sie heute noch? Und dann wüsste ich gerne, inwieweit der liebe Kracauer noch weiterlebt. Wer greift viele seiner Thesen noch sinnvoll auf, macht was daraus, führt das alles weiter? Sie haben so viele Autorinnen genannt. Ja? Das würde mich mal interessieren. Also das heißt, wo lebt er weiter? Und dann der Stellenwert von Frau Hansen. Danke.
Okay, vielleicht Felix auch noch direkt und dann können wir eine gesammelte Antwort geben mit Blick auf die Zeit.
Ja, noch eine weitere Referenz, die so zwischen euren beiden tollen Vorträgen vielleicht steht, Dziga Vertov, das Kameraauge, was für mich nochmal die Frage aufruft, ob für euch die Frage des Anthropomorphismus, sagen, der Kameratechnik selber, nicht auch nochmal die Frage der Dezentrierung oder der sozusagen auch das Filmische oder das Potenzial des Films, ne, da wo Kracauer vom filmischen Film spricht, ob nicht ja, Vertov mit der Rede vom Kameraauge nochmal eine weitere Frage oder Perspektive aufwirft, die betrifft sowohl die Frage, ob das Kameraauge eine andere Form von menschlichem Auge ist oder ob wir eher, das würde die Referenz zu den Drone-Shots sein, in bestimmten Kameratechniken eben sehen können, wie wir uns vorstellen, wie Tiere sehen. Also in dem Bärenvideo flog, glaube ich, auch ein Adler einmal durchs Bild. Also sehen wir wie der Adler, sehen wir wie die Fly on the Wall, wie es eben auch in mancher Filmtradition gemacht wurde oder gedacht wurde. Und also vor dem Hintergrund würde mich jetzt nochmal die Frage der Dezentrierung und die Frage natürlich des Potenzials des Films, ein Film sozusagen, der auf der Höhe auch dessen, was man Anthropozän nennt, vielleicht gefilmt wäre. Danke.
Vielleicht kann man nur zwei Fragen verbinden. Also die Frage, wer arbeitet auf interessante Weise mit Kracauer weiter? Ich glaube, so müsste man die wahrscheinlich stellen. Dazu gehört im englischsprachigen Kontext Jennifer Fay, die genau die Frage nach dem Anthropozän stellt und die mit Kracauer in die Arktik geht und fragt, genau diese Fragen verfolgt mit Hilfe von Kracauer und dann Inga in ihrem Buch über Vitalismus und Leben, also wie man Umwelten medial verstehen kann. Und das ist einfach, ich finde es ehrlich gesagt immer noch überraschend, wie viel da in Kracauer drinsteckt, weil einfach die Gegenwart dann neue Fragen aufwirft, die wir vorher nicht an ihn gerichtet haben. Und dadurch entsteht sowohl ein neuer Kracauer als auch ein neuer Blick auf gegenwärtige Perspektiven. Ganz kurz zum Kameraauge, Felix, das ist das Beispiel, was ich hatte es kurz zitiert, ich glaube Siegert verwendet wird als ein Beispiel dafür, wie die klassische Filmtheorie und die Leute, die über Film nachgedacht haben, zu technikzentriert verfahren. Und er interpretiert dann das Kameraauge als eine bloße Prothese, ja, und also Übertragung von Technik auf Mensch, statt, wie du jetzt sagst, anthropomorph zu denken. Und für mich ist da, also das gehört jetzt nicht direkt zu Kracauer, aber wenn man zurückgeht zu der Technikphilosophie von Kapp, der leitet die ganze Idee von Technik aus der Idee der Organprojektion her, wo also das Auge projiziert wird auf technologische Formen oder der Arm oder die Hand wird klassischerweise zur Axt. Und nicht als Prothese, wie bei McLuhan, wo also Media are the extensions of man bei McLuhan, sondern als eine Art Erkenntnis zu gewinnen. Dadurch, dass ich die Hand zur Axt mache und projiziere in die Axt, lerne ich was über die Hand. Also das ist der Grundansatz. Und ich denke, also wie gesagt, da gehört jetzt Kracauer nicht direkt in diese Linie rein, aber ich denke, dass die klassische Filmtheorie als solche in der Linie steht. Und also bei Münsterberg ist es sehr klar, aber dass man darüber nochmal nachdenken sollte, wie die klassische Filmtheorie sich mit diesem Problem auseinandersetzt. Und da kommen die Fragen nach Anthropomorphismus, Projektion, Prothese oder eben epistemischem Gewinn wieder zum Tragen.
Ja, also das ist ja auch, Lev Manowitsch bezieht sich ja auch auf Werthoff sozusagen, um so eine Idee der neuen Medien zu entwerfen. Und bei Werthoff selbst ist es ja auch so, dass dass seine Filme schon irgendwie so die Idee haben, dass man eben durch den Film und im Film und mit filmischen Mitteln so eine Art Zukunftsmensch, also man setzt die Zukunft, also sozusagen die revolutionäre Zukunft in die Gegenwart durch den Film. Also da ist ja so ein interessantes zeitliches Moment, also in seiner Montagearbeit, und genau diese Setzung einer Zukunft, die jetzt schon da ist, das ist ja dieses Posthumane, das man, glaube ich, irgendwie von Kracauer schon stark unterscheiden muss. Und dann wollte ich noch kurz sagen, zu Gertruds Kommentar, das ist ja auch irgendwie dieser Unterschied zwischen Wirklichkeit und Realität, also dass Wirklichkeit eben genau das ist, was nicht erreichbar ist, was immer außerhalb unserer Reichweite ist, was man nicht fassen kann. Also darum bleibt es ja, dieses Projekt ja auch immer so unabschließbar, und darum ist Realität selbst ja auch nur wie so eine Passage in Richtung auf eine Wirklichkeit, wo wir wahrscheinlich aber nie ankommen werden. Also so scheint es ja schon in Kracauers frühen Texten auf. Also ich frage mich, ob man das vielleicht damit verbinden könnte mit einem Punkt. Und Miriam ist natürlich, war ja gestern schon irgendwie immer aufgerufen, ist, glaube ich, egal ob man sich hüben oder drüben befindet, ganz zentrale Figur, gerade wenn es um Kracauer geht. Da sind sich, glaube ich, alle einig.
Prima. Ja, dann vielen Dank für die Diskussion, für die Vorträge. Es wird sicherlich auch noch weitere Gelegenheiten geben, weiter zu diskutieren. Um 12:30 Uhr geht es weiter dann mit den Workshops. Genau. Herzlichen Dank.